Hey Brainiacs, just a quick update on what is happening on the Patreon episodes coming up over the next couple weeks. You're going to hear a couple of dives into history of mental health, one of which is the history of forensic psychology, how and when mental health experts started weighing in on things that have to do with crimes. Another dive into the origin of the Mr. Rogers program in celebration of Mr. Rogers' birthday coming up. We're going to be talking about how he utilized the medium of television, very new at the time, with the concept of we can teach kids with this stuff. There'll also be a couple of full episodes for those of you working in the mental health field. There's going to be an episode about practice building and ways to orient your practice towards that. Also, my brother, Christian, is going to join me to have a discussion about media, pop culture, and diversity and inclusion, and how we like to see that happening, and also why it makes people so mad, and what is so activating about that. So those coming up on the Patreon. Check out patreon.com/brokenbrain, or go to my website, dwighthurst.com/support, in order to learn about how you might join the work.
The Broken Brain.
Recording in progress.
Welcome back, Brainiacs, to The Broken Brain, your favorite podcast. Yes, I just went ahead and elevated it to that for you, so you're welcome. It's your host, Dwight, once again here for your dose of mental health and wellness and all-around warmth and goodness here today on this wonderful morning, or whatever time you happen to be listening to it. That's how podcasts work. I am joined today by Joe Schaeppi. Joe is a psychotherapist who focuses on the use of adventure, the use of gaming. We're going to talk about how you use some of those things, video games, and even some AI tools that are new on the scene. And so I'm interested to see how you are doing that. Joe's also the founder, CEO, master and commander. I'm going to throw in probably clinical director too. People like to add those titles, however many you want to have, of Solston, which I'm sure you'll tell us about too. So Joe, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's go ahead and start out by telling everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got into this sordid business of mental health.
Yeah. So Grandpa was an eye doctor, and I wanted to be an eye doctor too. Just thought the eyes were so cool, and he practiced all the way till he was 89 years old. So was in practice for a long time. And I remember sitting down as a kid, and he would say, that whole eyes are the gateway to the soul thing. But he said, when you've examined eyes for this long, he's like, it's pretty interesting what you can tell about a person from a diet perspective, from a mental health perspective, from a cognitive perspective. And in many ways, we have your eyes, your LGM, we have our occipital lobe. It's 30% of our brain. It's the biggest part of our brain. So visual processing. So I think there's research to be done and a future to be had where I think there's a lot there. So I went to—
That's wild. Now I got to get an eye doctor on here.
Yeah, I bet if you started searching for like eye doctors and cognitive diagnosis, there's probably something there. But I volunteered in Minneapolis at Methodist Hospital when I was in high school. So I volunteered as an orderly. So I was like cleaning up after surgeries. I was setting things up because I wanted to be pre-med. And I really I think that was a big aha moment. Some of the surgeons there were actually friends of my grandfather, and kind of coming to me saying, Joe, you don't want to do this. It's not like it used to be. And okay. But I think one of the big wake up moments was how many cases in the ER were mental health cases. So in the United States today, like 7 out of 8 ER visits have a mental health component to them.
7 out of 8. That's, people should let that sink in, that number. That's tremendously high.
According to one study,
Sure.
But I think, it's pretty high. And I think there's a couple other, it's like 1 out of every 2. But the challenge is most of those go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. Like when someone's bleeding out, you're not going to send in the psychiatrist and say, okay, how did this really happen? You're going to fix that situation. So I think one of the challenges, for ER visits and what's going on there is there's this whole mental health component that was on the side, and that's where I really realized, like, if I'm going upstream. So a theme of this whole conversation will be I've been trying to get upstream of the problem through my whole career. So I went from I want to help people to I don't think being an eye doctor is going to do that. I think being a psychologist is going to do that. And then started volunteering in that part of the hospital and really seeing like, wow, most of the people here, it's very clinical situations, acute clinical mental health sort of issues that actually end up in a hospitalized. This was 2004 when I was doing this, and said, well, what if we architected and designed environments and digital experiences in a way where we could get ahead of a lot of these things that, like you look at Zoom brain and cognitive fatigue, and how do we build environments in a way that are actually healthier for people? So I didn't go down the clinical mental health counselor route right away. I actually went into human factor psychology at the University of Wisconsin and studied that in anthropology. And that's part of why I spent a long career in user experience, working with big companies, was how can I actually architect things that millions of people use to be like 1% healthier? So that was a focus for me. And one of the kind of hit me in the face moments was when you will do a lot of these big projects, whether you're using Instagram or Facebook, a lot of the people that designed those products weren't really thinking about what's the mental health impact. Like University of Michigan, came out with a study that was showing Facebook caused depression, like it was causal, not just So I don't think the guy that made the like button had any ill intent. It's just there wasn't a thought to how are we architecting.
There's a surface level thought there. Sorry to break it. I just I get
Oh, yeah,
excited.
please, yeah,
There's
please.
that surface level, like, well, people like to be liked, so there you go. Period. Instead of like, not necessarily thinking about the repercussions of what is going to come next. Yeah.
Exactly. What's the impact? And so one of the hardest things I had a time of was really actually measuring this stuff. Like, how do you measure the psychological impact of physical space, of digital usage, of product usage? It was really hard to get upstream. And I also noticed too, being a researcher, especially when you're designing products, creating experiences, typically at the end of the day, everybody uses products or experiences most of the time for cognitive reasons. So like video games, for example, if you ask people like, there's something called the PANAS, is this the positive and negative of affect schedule. It's a questionnaire that you can evaluate mood. If you look at that, for example, before people play a game, people who, for example, are really excited or they're happy or they're full of joy, typically they're using the game to amplify positive emotions. We tend to want to amplify positive emotions or stop negative ones. So for the same people or different people who are high on anxiety or higher on depression, and you look at the game that they play and that's where they're at before playing the game typically lowers those things for them. So it's when we have a negative thing, we use whether it's shopping or going to a certain store we love, those things maybe are to make us feel better. And so really getting into that, and when you really interview a person on why do you use a product, why do you engage in an experience, why do you love these things, you end up typically at the end of it getting to their actual pain points in life, not their like pain points with oh, I don't like Zoom, or I don't like this microphone, or these headphones. It's usually like, this is what I'm really struggling with. And when I was doing a big project in Switzerland, there was a woman who was like a senior director of a company, and she just basically said, "Hey, I need to tell you that my husband beats me. I've never told anyone this before." And I only had a bachelor's at that point in human factors psychology and anthropology. I was like, I just asked all these questions to understand you, and I have no idea what to do right now or how to respond to that. Or do I report that? And I was maybe 24 at the time. So that was my cue that, hey, if I'm doing this and if I'm truly going to be good at creating experiences that can help with mental health at scale, I probably should practice. So that's where I went back. And for me, I grew up skiing. I'm a big skier. Actually, when I was in Utah, I was sponsored by the North Face for a little bit. So that was a really fun part, fun
As
part
a
of my
skier
life.
or as a therapist?
As I wish as both.
Yes.
That would have been cool.
I've been
as
dying
a-
for years to get I mean, you know, always hoping to sponsors on the show, but I've had this idea for years, this goofy idea of having sponsored therapy sessions and be like, I got to tell you today, the session is sponsored by this, and you don't have to pay for it. Anyway, sorry, I'm sure we'll call North Face together after this call.
That'd be cool. That remind me of like my practicum when you like watch people, all your classmates. And you learn a lot. That'd be pretty cool. But that was it's always been a big passion for me. And so I started looking at different clinical programs, and I literally was just Googling like skiing psychology, ski therapy, adventure, and a little bit about what you and I were talking about. I found 3 universities, University of Georgia, Kristianstad in Norway, and then Prescott College in Arizona. And the setup for Prescott just really fit me. So they offer like you can specialize in eco psychology, adventure psychology, equine assisted therapy. So for the horse people out there, but it's a really cool niche program in school. And the people that run it, like if you go and look up the book Adventure Therapy, the professors there are the people that wrote a lot of the chapters like in these books.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
people like Mari Lung, just amazing people. And she has some really cool side like power of play, a lot of books on play therapy, these sort of things. And so for me, it was like a natural fit personally. And it always made sense instinctually for me that these two things need to go together, and they're very powerful when they come together. So that sent me down this path of I was interning in Utah with a woman named Dr. Sugarman, who's incredible. She's from an assessment side of things, amazing. So a lot of neuropsychological assessment, traumatic brain injuries, these sort of patients. And I was seeing them as a psychotherapist, and really, going upstream from that. One of the things that really, I'll pause here, impacted me, I think, was seeing how well adventure therapy really works. Like it's amazing. Like when your brain is in a state of play, you can rewire neurons within 10 repetitions of a certain activity, where it's like hundreds of times if you're on a couch doing CBT.
Yeah. That's I was fascinated. I heard you quote that or mention that in an interview that you had done on another podcast. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit to the listeners, for those who may not be aware, and you're talking about like frequency of synapses and learning ability. How do we measure that, and what does that mean exactly for people who may not be up on that or just kind of pretend they know? I've fallen into both camps before.
Yeah. So I think an easy, or like a way I like to think of it, is kind of like a dirt road versus a highway. So you have these neurons in your brain, and what we think and we repeatedly do is how our brain wires. Our brain is wired to be efficient. I think that's the thing. Like, so I like maybe the smoking example is like every time you have a cigarette when you're nervous, like almost you can look at it in the brain. You have these dendrites, which are attached to these neurons, and they'll cluster. That's what we mean when we say neuronal clustering. They'll move together so they can fire more efficiently. The brain is built to be efficient. And that's, I think, an important story, because cognitively, it's or just physiologically, it's an expensive organ. It uses lots of glucose, lots of energy. So that's why a lot of people are like, man, I did this thing unconsciously. I didn't even think. And it's like, yeah, because your brain is built to not have to think. It's built to try to preserve energy. And so when we say like 10 times versus 500 times, I like to think of it in terms of like a dirt road and a superhighway. So when we're really little and small, our brain, we have a lot more of what we call neuroplasticity. Part of what that means is those associations can happen more loosely and flexibly. So we can cluster and recluster and create basically more flexibility there. Where as we get older, so think of like dirt road for a younger brain. As we get older and we reinforce things over and over and over and over again, this is kind of the you can't teach an old dog new tricks. These pathways in the brain become more like a 6-lane highway in Los Angeles. And so if you want to move a 6-lane highway in Los Angeles in a different direction, it takes a lot of trucks, a lot of power tools, a lot of resources. So it's very, very expensive process to do that. So when you're an adult and you go, I'm going to go to cognitive behavioral therapy, there's this thing that, I get depressed around sometimes, or I kind of have a little bit of anxiety all the time. And once you and your therapist work towards the issue, they're going to help you with cognitive behavioral therapy to rewire. Hey, smoking cessation. Okay, every time you feel stressed, let's replace that with this other thing. Maybe it's a video game instead of smoking a cigarette. And over time, those dendrites, the brain, it's going to rewire so those electrical signals can be way more efficient. And that's where it takes literally 500 or so repetitions of a thing to do that when it's just using like CBT. But when you're in a state of play, what's powerful about play, and adventure therapy is even like there's studies on play therapy, but not adventure therapy in terms of this sort of thing. I would bet it's even like 3 to 4 times even. So what's interesting about play is if you look at a brain when it's under play, it looks very different. It's super cool. Play requires a sense of safety, a sense of openness. There's this freeness to it. But what's interesting about play is when you look at all mammals, whether it's 2 small squirrels, or we're here in Berlin right now in Germany at the zoo in Berlin, like you look at the little monkeys, they're playing together, rolling around, and play is how we learn as mammals. Play is an incredibly efficient way to learn. What's interesting about adventure is typically a type of play, but tends to be some risk to it. So when you're under a state of like slight stress, or what we call eustress, so positive stress. So one of the goals of adventure therapy is, hey, let's say we're doing skiing and we think that skiing is the right modality for you. It could be, if you buy the book Adventure Therapy, it'll give you all the different type of adventure type things you can do with somebody based on their risk profile. So like high ropes courses, for example, are one of the lowest risk activities you can do to highest perceived risk. And what you're trying to induce in the patient is effectively a perception of danger in a positive setting. And why we're doing that is that helps release epinephrine, which is adrenaline. And what's cool about that is when you're in a positive mindset and you release epinephrine is into the brain is kind of like a neural lubricant. So when we're talking about moving those highways, it actually makes it even easier to move those highways. So play plus a little bit of adrenaline in a positive setting really is so cool for helping to rewire the brain. In a lot of ways, it makes sense. Like if you were running from the lion, 30,000 years ago, your brain is going to have to think in different ways than it probably did in a day-to-day. Like neurocognitively, you probably have to have more divergent thinking happening at that moment, which means glucose expenditure is going to go way up because your brain's going to use a lot of that energy. But it's almost like reversing PTSD. You have a negative thing happen repeatedly. Your brain wires around that. Well, if you have that same intense environment, and I'm not talking about like complex PTSD, but an actual event that caused PTSD,
Sure.
You have that same intense environment in a positive way, and allows us to help rewire. And I think that's why if you look at a lot of studies on like surf therapy. There's some interesting ones in California for like war veterans. It's some of the most successful research you can find on actual PTSD, almost even just going away completely without medication or things like this. So yeah, huge. So that was adventure therapy for me was something I fell in love with when you see it work, and it was like hey, problem is research and funding. So that's where it's literally called adventure therapy. I think it's Gass, Gillis, Lee, and Russell are the authors of that book. But it's meant for psychologists and clinicians. But it's great stuff.
It's interesting how little we respect that in our culture. A lot of times we don't take play into account, and even with play therapy, very highly researched, particularly for young children. And also much more effective for young children than talk therapy, for crying out loud. Shouldn't be a surprise, but I've had so many people I have met who have said to me, well, we were taking our kid to this one therapist, but they just played games all day, or, they played games all session. And it's like, and they'll yank someone from therapy because it's their kid. Cause it's like, I just don't think they're, and sometimes without giving them a chance. Not to say that parents, you decide what's right for your kid and everything and all those qualifiers, At the same time, though, invest a little into a process, and there are times where activity, and we're finding for all ages, right? It does something. Even some of the sit down on the couch techniques that I've been profiling a lot on the show, IFS, EMDR, some of those, you look at that is more, they're trying to do some of the same thing mentally, right? Which is engage with activity-based therapy and some of those kinds of things. I'm really happy to see, for all the good that CBT can do in certain applications, and as you put it, it does actually help rewire things. But I'm so glad to see that we've broadened our perspective in therapy to say, oh, this kind of work. Instead of doing what we think works, we want to do what works.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. That's, more broadly speaking, it was kind of mind opening, for me, that a lot's changed in clinical psychology and therapy since the 90s, and efficacy based practice is so important, and staying on top of the research and what's working and what's really, I think you called it out. If you look at things like, EMDR, what we're talking about is, how do we help the brain, given certain things, get to where we need to get to? And I think it's like Aldous Huxley wrote this book called The Perennial Philosophy. It's more or less about how all religions are talking about the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of times there's a lot of, there's this, it's like, if 10 is success, you can be 7 plus 3, you can be 5 plus 5, you can be 8 plus 2. There's a lot of ways to get to 10. There's a lot of ways to get to success. And I think for therapists, in particular psychologists, using what you naturally are inclined to and inclined towards is going to allow you help aid others towards their success in therapy better than if you just go, oh, I should do adventure therapy too. It's like, well, read about it, and if your heart feels it, you're probably going to be good at it. Yeah. But if EMDR is something that you're gravitating more, if that, or somatic psychology, or if that's something that then do that, and I think you're going to have a lot of success with your patients.
I helped to co-facilitate, because I did a lot of play therapy when I used to work with more younger children. I don't do that as much now, although it's nice to always have a couple young kids on the caseload because they're fun. But yeah, I was able to, I have a good friend of mine who is one of the only fully certified and trained and trainer, the whole 9 yards of certifications for play therapy. And I was lucky enough to help her out with a presentation where we taught some clinicians. And one of the very first things we did under her direction, was we brought in a whole bunch of toys and little games. We set up Jenga, we had little Legos, and we put 2 long tables filled with these very rudimentary, just kind of your basic toys. And we had all the therapists come up and play with them for a while. And then we had everybody sit down and we talked about, how do you play? And she was talking about how important it is to know, how do you play? And not that you're going to make all your clients do that exactly, but to know, how am I approaching this? What do I value in play? Some kids, for example, love setting up stuff so much so that, well, when are you going to start playing? It's like, well, they are playing. And I'm curious a little about the subjectivity. I love the element of risk and the appropriate balance of risk that you mean when you say adventure therapy. What's the role of subjectivity in that? You get someone who's like, wow, I go to Yellowstone and walk around and that's my adventure, and a little kind of a maybe brisk walk and hike, is like, I'm getting out and I don't usually do that. That's great. And then you've got people who are like, I've got to parasail into a volcano.
Yeah.
Those are,
Totally.
there's a lot of real estate in between those two options, of course.
Yes, it's everything, and that's kind of how you come to before you start doing adventure therapy. On the intake side of thing, that's what you need to understand, and it's what activity. So you're taking into account, what activities the person already does and already enjoys. Because when you look at you can look at Mihaly. I always can't pronounce his name. Csikszentmihalyi, I think, the guy who is the flow person. If you look at flow states and how healing they are. Yeah, I'm bad at pronouncing his, but Mihaly, I know that's his first name. But he wrote the book Flow, and if you look at flow states and a lot of the research behind being in a state of flow, it's incredibly healing. And so people have, like, I think the definition for flow is more or less when your challenge is slightly higher than your skill level. And especially if you are in a dynamic environment, and especially in a dynamic environment in nature, that's like optimal for flow induction. So like surfing is kind of like a natural flow inducer. Like if you're not good at all, you can't really paddle past the whitewater. You're just going to stay in that until you can, and then you can paddle a little bit further, and et cetera, unless you're really, really strong and somehow make it out to the back. But I think, different activities have different abilities to produce flow, but definitely adventure sports are up there. Like people are like, what about painting? I'm like, that's great. But if you look at, mood and or flow disposition and like flow studies, it tends to be these like extreme adventure sports where flow is really being optimized for. So if somebody is like, I was ex-military, I'm a big mountain skier, like you're going to go to, okay, well, where at what moments do you perceive risk in those settings, and how do we create safety in that, so there's no actual real danger or potential real danger. Actually, like in the adventure therapy book, they have the risk profiles of all the different activities, so you're able to account for that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, like, hey, I heard about this, I'm really interested in this, but like everything freaks me out. So I had, for example, a person who was on vacation. We were in Breckenridge, and they wanted to do a therapy session. And so what they had MS, and their issue was that the lesions were on the left side of their brain, and then sometimes on the right side of their body, they would have effectively spasms or not be able to use that, and it would kind of fail them, like from the tremors. And so they wanted to know, is my anxiety what's causing my paralysis, or is it the actual MS? And they didn't know at that point in their life which one was it. They were really like, they didn't feel empowered. They're like, I can't ride a bicycle anymore. I can't do these things anymore. And I was like, let's go ski. And they're like, my neurologist is going to kill me. They said I can't even ride a bicycle. I'm like, no, 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 no. Well, so what did we do? We started with, we're at, in America, we're at, I don't know, 11,000 feet elevation, because it's the base of Breckenridge. We literally just started out by putting on a ski boot. Just being at 11,000 feet, and this couple was from Louisiana. So the husband was there. He's like, I want to see how this works, because he was an ex-fighter pilot, really interesting guy. And they had tried everything. And her quality of life was, she was getting more and more inside. She didn't want to leave the house. She didn't want to go grocery shopping. She didn't want to do anything. And I said, let's talk about depression and anxiety later. Let's talk about this part of you feeling capable to walk and go places. And my goal was to get her to be able to distinguish what was a MS-induced tremor versus panic attack. So I said, let's figure out the panic attack thing and these kind of spikes. So first panic attack happened the second she put on a ski boot, actually, when we were up there. So, what we got trained in was for panic attacks, and I know a lot of hospitals do this now, is body scanning. So how does your feet feel? How do your knees feel? Tell me what you see. Tell me what you hear. getting the person to go back into the body. And they're actually training this in ERs now for nurses, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
So we did that. We came back. And so we said, okay, let's put on the second boot. And we did the second boot. And for her, it wasn't like, I don't want to do this anymore, because she's like, I have panic attacks all the time. So, okay, we put on the second ski boot. We just walked around with the ski boots. And she was just, even that, you could see the adrenaline was there. And so we can start doing CBT. We can start processing some of these things. And that moment, she's, hey, let's sit down on the chair and let's talk. What's so powerful about this story is on the second day, we actually got skis on. We walked around for a little bit. We went to, there's like the bunny hill, but then before you even go on the bunny hill, there was a tiny little slope just to go here, then to go on, like just to go up the bunny hill. So we started by, let's just get the feeling of going down that. So now we're like starting flow states. We're feeling gravity. We're in the zone. And we're talking about that dirt field versus that, super highway. She's probably more of like a 2 or 3 lane highway. So, but now that epinephrine's starting in a state of eustress, and I'm going, hey, tell me about the times when this really gets activated. Tell me about what do you fear the most? What thoughts come up for you that really trigger this? And we're able to do this session all in this sort of kind of state of play and adventure. And we're changing the brain in real time. And what was so cool, so on the third day, we did some skiing down the bunny hill that day. On the third day, we were able to do like a green run, and the snow was pretty deep because it was a good snowfall on Breckenridge that week, and I had her fall. And that was like terrifying for her to fall down, because snow, I can't get up. And so we did that, and we worked on falling, because that was one of her biggest fears, was if I fall, like what's going to happen? And snow is a great place to learn how to fall, especially if it's nice and fluffy. And so we did that, and the husband came. So I only had her for 3 days, and I didn't know if they were leaving for vacation. That's all they booked with me. And the husband came to me on, like, I was still up on the mountain the 4th day and had some other clients. And he just came and said, that was nuts. Just yesterday, she said, no, it's just my anxiety. So she was having a lot of somatic effects from her panic attacks before. And the outcome was that she could now distinguish whether it was a panic attack or whether it was her MS. And that was huge for her. And he actually sent me an email, because I gave this couple my email like 3 months later, of a picture of her riding a bike, and which was the no-go from the neurologist. And he's like, he's still like shocked that can happen. And so that's on the subjective side. And it's not about pushing the person at all. If all we did was end with that little spot on the bunny hill, that would have still been a great victory. But what's so cool, I think, is a lot of people, because adventure and play are naturally fun when you get into that flow state. So it changed from fear to excitement. And in many ways, those two emotions can be similar. Like, they can sometimes ride on the same edge, but on that positive environment, when you have, and I'm also like, I was a certified ski instructor too. So that's part of what,
I would imagine you have to know how to safely do the thing that you're doing as well. It's not like,
that's
get on this hang glider. I've never done it either. Hey, let's do it.
No. Yeah. Like adventure therapy, equine, like a lot of the equine assisted people, they have all their horse stuff that, it's not like, oh yeah, I've never been with horses before, let's just do some therapy.
I like horses, but I don't know that. Yeah. Well, and just like with the play therapy and what people maybe think of it, I think your description is really, really useful for people to hear, because there's so much more going on than skiing. As you put it, it could be almost any behavior or any action if it does that. There's the mitigation of the risk factor versus not actually putting someone in danger. And at this, having a little bit of that perception, really talking, setting it up right. And then the thing that occurred to me was, it reminds me of exposure therapy, which is often thought of as a cognitive behavioral thing, but it's kind of like deepened. Would you say? I mean,
Yes.
it's more than just exposure therapy. It's like, or even flooding, you might call, because there's introduction to the stimulus right out of the gate. But there's more going on than that, and maybe you could talk a little bit to the differences there.
Yeah, I mean, first off, you have nature as a healer. You can read studies on, like, from Japan, for example, on the scent of pine and how pine scent reduces cortisol levels. There's a lot of really interesting stuff there, but you have nature on the one side, who's, that's naturally going to be really healing, and then with all the stuff going on, there's everything we talked about before. So we have that epinephrine that's on our team too. But then in a therapeutic sense, one of the most powerful things about adventure therapy is something we call kinesthetic metaphor. So when they do something physiologically with the body, and they go, hey, when I get up from when I'm, in the snow, that's kind of like, when I have a really hard thing to overcome, when I'm trying to figure it out, how I get up and figure out how to get up, given that, like, my other part of my body is, like, much weaker. So it's a little bit of a puzzle piece at first. Like, when I have to go do groceries, or when I have to figure out my bills, or, like, I know I can do it because I physiologically did it in this setting. So you get to be able to create these knowings, the body keeps the score. Your body knows that it's capable. And so those kinesthetic metaphors of being able to say, kinesthetically, I was able to do this in this adventure setting. I was able to, go across the high ropes course from, I could take all these leaps, knowing that if I'm securing myself and I'm not going to fall, I can take leaps that I wouldn't otherwise take. Oh, I'm at work now. There's a risk that I want to take that could result in a promotion, starting a new company, whatever you want to do. And if I secure myself in that well enough, where I know that if I jump, I'm still not going to fall, I can take that risk then. I can have higher risk tolerance. So kinesthetic metaphor and nature, and this is part of why when people say, like, hey, take out all of the jargon, all the psychology stuff, what should I go do? Like, play in the forest. Because there's something about the forest and kinesthetic metaphor and the amount of opportunities or just walk in the forest. Like, all these different things can provide you with these kinesthetic metaphors that can be very powerful in your life. Combined with the biophilia effect and, the effects of nature, you put all that together, it's like an easy first thing for that. So yeah, I think that's a big model. And then the other is just, if you look at, this is something we know at Solston, we basically have the largest psychological database in the world. Probably the number one motivator for human beings is flow state. The second biggest is probably pride and productivity. And what that means, and there's some quotes around this, that happiness is kind of just an unfolding of productivity over time. Like, when you have a day where you just check all your boxes, and people tend to feel really good when they have that. And so what's nice about what other things are really going on there, one is flow. And I think it's I forget the researcher, it starts with an S, but he's like, all the stuff on why flow is healthy, he's run multiple studies on that. So that's one of the other things. And this is part of why video games are good for your brain too. This is a back to play, video games being a really accessible version of play.
Yeah, I want to get into some of that gameplay and tech aspect too. So this is perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's that part that I think that, I mean, maybe we can pivot to that now, but those there's this momentum of things and the progression, the achievement side of things. If you look at people, so when I work with patients who have major depression, I tend to use something called the AMI. It's Achievement Motivation Inventory, and it looks at, basically, if you look across the entire AMI, it's measuring everything from compensatory effort to status orientation to flow to pride and productivity to eagerness to learn, all these core motivators. People who have major depression tend to be very low across the board. And I like to start out with well, what is the one motivator that we can really work with for that person? Because then I can really take a person-centered approach. But if you look at pride and productivity being like, honestly, I've seen at Solston, we've seen hundreds of millions of psychological profiles. And pride and productivity pretty much shows up on every single one. So if happiness is somewhat of an unfolding of checking boxes of being productive, that's another thing that venture therapy environment allows for, because there's progression. And that's what there's in games too. There's a sense of progression where if I go to a therapist and I sit down on a couch, I'm probably not going to be leaving with a sense of progression.
And with the gameplay, it's very interesting to me how that has been, I'll just say kind of generationally, I think it's moved forward in this way, but there's been kind of a demonization of that, of just, oh, this is a big waste of time, and why can't we teach kids real things? And I've thought it's very weird dichotomy of how, like, I could go and say, hey, my daughter advanced in her, got the next belt in her karate class, right? But at the same time, this same daughter currently, we're playing Mario Wonder for Christmas. That was a new one. And it was interesting to mark the idea of she was the one to deal the final blow to the big boss, right? And it's like, wow, do you remember when she started playing some video games, it was like she'd kind of, and for those who know Mario 3D, she would get in the safety bubble and float around while her sister did some of the hard things so she wouldn't fall off a cliff. And apologize, I have someone outside in the hallway vacuuming, so hopefully that's not coming through too strong for people.
I can't hear it at all.
Oh, okay, great. So hopefully no one can, and then they just get to hear my exciting narration of my life as it is with vacuum attacks. But anyway, for her to see, there's this progress of, boy, the first time I played this, I could barely do anything. And now it's like I can play it by myself all the way through. And why can't I be proud of that? And if you tell someone that, there are people who get, oh, that's cool. And others that would be like, oh, well, shouldn't you be more proud of a soccer goal? And it's like, nothing against soccer, but I don't know. Do you know what I mean? And I'm curious about your thoughts about this, as you mentioned that progression and gameplay and its importance.
Yeah, I mean, gaming is amazing. And when I first started telling a lot of my psychology and therapy friends that I was going to start Solston 6 years ago, some of them got mad at me. They're like, no, like gaming's so bad for people, and the DSM, there's gaming addiction and it's horrible. And I'm like, based on what evidence? Gaming addiction is one thing, but I said just gaming, based on what evidence? Show me the evidence. Because even back then, the evidence was quite the contrary. And one of the things I noticed, because what going to swimming upstream to how do we really solve these problems in bigger ways? Like I noticed a lot of my patients who had major depression, some of the suicidal younger kids, when I asked them, what was the last time you remembered something that you felt joy, you felt a sense of joy? Because usually, with major depression and, someone who is truly suicidal, that's a hard one for them. And I'm just looking for a little bit of traction. I know with the suicidal ones, they're getting a trip to the hospital anyway. And while we're waiting for the trip, I'm asking these kind of questions. And what I notice is a lot of them would tell me a video game. And so, you look at what's there, and if you look at the research today, it's overwhelming now, like the benefits of gaming. So if you look at, for example, there's a study that looked at play, and people that stop, basically don't play any video games past the age of 30. What they saw was that crystal memory tends to go up as we get older, but fluid memory tends to go down. So younger teenagers, this is usually why they're like, Dad, you're so dumb. Because teenagers typically in the past has been when like fluid memory really spikes. It's like they're really good with that. But crystal memory, and older people are like, God, teenagers are so dumb, because the wisdom of remembering all these things is there. But when adults, no matter at what age, started playing a game, and it could be a mobile game, it could be like Switch, PlayStation, whatever, fluid memory started going back up again. So everything from like memory to actual like depression, anxiety. There's several studies, like one really interesting one that's pretty recent. Mario, like literally playing Mario, uh, beat cognitive behavioral therapy by about 50% when it came to reduction in depression. So like didn't just like kind of beat it, like incremental validity, like literally kicked its ass. And so and we see that in our data all the time. And so the thing about games that's interesting is games are like how I see them over the last 6 years. And maybe just to talk about like quickly what we do at Solstin. So I was doing tons of psychological assessment in Utah. I realized most therapists couldn't leverage assessment. And then I realized like play is just this powerful way to help people. And if you look at like Denver, Colorado, for example, a large percent of the youth population there have never even been in the mountains. They've seen it every day, but they've never been in the mountains. And so like a lot of people don't have access to adventure therapy activities. Like most of my clients, I mean, we're talking about Breckenridge, flying from Louisiana, Pilot, like a lot of the people that have the money to spend on a therapist for 6 hours a day or 4 hours a day, it's a really specific population. And so I'm like, hey, how do we make this more accessible? Well, a lot of people don't realize that there's 4 billion people in the world right now that have smartphones. There's 3 billion people in the world that literally play games every day, like video games. It's 3/4 of all the digital world is playing video games. And so you have this really, really accessible form of play that's right in your pocket. And just in like the App Store, there's about 800,000 games. So what we do at Solstin is while people are playing games, we anonymously measure about 300 different psychological traits while they're playing the game. One of our goals as a company was to improve diagnostics, so actual psychological diagnosis. Back to that too, like when we did neuropsych evals it's $7,000, $6,000, same thing. The amount of people that can actually pay for a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation. And I'm sure you know that story. It's
very much so. I mean, access to care. It's funny because people used to laugh. They've done these studies about curative factors of therapy, and we usually talk about number 2, which is the bond and the teamwork you set up with your therapist. That's like one of the best predictors of success. And we talk about number 2, and people used to laugh. I hear the number 1 in all these studies that they do is if you go. And people used to be like, oh, that's one of those research, that's dumb, of course, if you go. And it's like, that's become increasingly pertinent as we found that not only are there social barriers or prejudice or things that separate people from therapy nowadays, especially like with changes in insurance and different things, cost it governs people's frequency, the type of therapy. Oh, I really need this big, more heavy intervention, but all I can afford is going once or twice a month to an individual session. And even my therapist tells me it's going to be of limited benefit, and I'm still, that's all. What else am I going to do? And some people are lucky to have that, right?
And you see your therapist once a month, and as a therapist, as a psychologist, like try having, imagine like building a relationship, with your partner, seeing them once a month. Like we got to catch up on what happened. There's so much in between. And usually the more critical the case is, the worse self-reflection is too. So that's, we're human beings. We're already
sure. If I spend, and there's a certain amount of work, even just in therapy sessions, that if you're coming, let's say if you're coming every week or even twice a week, if you're in a high crisis mode, some of those, even with these activity-based things and everything, once in a while, someone's just like, I got to talk about what happened this week, and that's all we're going to do today. And so if that's the only thing, and that's going to store up if it's not as frequent. And so trying to get that accessibility is huge. And it's so funny about, this is over 5 years ago. I don't know, maybe a lot more. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he's not a therapist. He's a writer, just a writer of fiction. Brandon Nobles, if anyone wants to look him up. And he made this comment to me about, boy, what if we had an Angry Birds So this is going back a bit. What if we had an Angry Birds that taught people to have empathy? Wouldn't that be cool? And so that pops in my head every time now that I'm seeing more and more of these things that are like either directly designed for mental health or are having people like you involved, who are saying like, what could we do to get some treatment in this case, literally in the hands of people on their device?
So that's exactly what we do. So we've worked with Rovio's who makes Angry Birds. So these are our actual customers. And that's, when you look at Angry Birds, it's the most watched show on Netflix, because kids watch shows
Really?
1,000 times, not just once. So if you want to have, oh yeah. But so what we do is take games like some of our customers' games and say, hey, did you know your game's like really good at measuring depression? Or your game's really good at measuring anxiety, and actually anxiety gets better or decreases with people with this psych profile. So we're putting some of these games. I'm here in Berlin. There's the main hospital here is called Charité. So one thing we're doing is working with the neurology department on taking real games, because there's a lot of like medical games. The thing is once it's not fun, it's not a game anymore.
Right. And that's always been the divide. I mean, even in schools, it's like, here's the math video game. And kids are like, well, it's better than no video game, but only just.
But that's the thing, like, it's a task. Just because something might have game elements doesn't mean it's a game. A game is play with rules. That's what a game is. And it's only a game if it's also fun. So if you take play and put rules around it and it's not fun anymore, then it's a task, then it's a chore. So like Kili Interactive, for example, they have a game called Endeavor. It's you can prescribe it for ADHD, so it's FDA approved. That game, which it has research showing that it improves ADHD, or it measures and improves ADHD for kids. If I prescribe that to one of my former kiddos, they're going to ask their mom, can I be done and play Fortnite now, please? Can I be done and play Angry Birds? The reality is it's really hard to make a really good game. And so we said, we're not going to fight against the current. And if you look to your exact point, if you ask medical doctors, what's one of the biggest problems in the medical system today? They'll tell you patient adherence. And, you say like, okay, people showing up to therapy, people doing, for me, the biggest thing was, there's all these people out there who go, oh yeah, I'm working on myself. I'm seeing a therapist. And even when I was doing intake, cool. So you saw this therapist. Can you tell me about what strategies you implemented and how you did those on a day-to-day? What do you mean? Well, we just talk. I'm like, well, then you're not getting better, are you? Like, because it's not about me. It's not about that hour-long session. With adventure therapy, it is a little bit more, or things like EMDR. But like, for me, it's about, well, what strategies are they implementing, and are we sticking to those strategies while I'm not there? And the cool thing about games is, the average gamer plays games for at least an hour a day, 1 to 3. Well, we actually saw there's some research. So before a kid's like 7 years old, they shouldn't be playing games. They shouldn't really have screen time. If they do play games, it should be like Sesame Street type games. Before 3, there should be no screen time. So, we see a lot of research showing don't do that. But as the kid gets older, there's some really interesting research on it was, I think, 11 to 13-year-olds who, the ones that played video games for at least 3 hours a day, like well outperformed all their other classmates. And, there's a point where something is an addiction, of course, and it's not healthy, which when it's impacting your school activities, your friendships, if it's negatively impacting your health, that's an addiction. We need to talk about that. And there is a such thing as gaming addiction. And you can almost be addicted to anything. And on the other hand, though, the benefits far outweigh the risks. And so if you look at a lot of the research overall for cognitive benefit for games, what people ask is like, well, what game should I play then? There's 800,000 of them. We could tell you that because we can take your psych profile, and we're actually, if you go to like wellbeing.solston.io, we did a free thing during COVID just to help people. But it gives you some basic psych profile stuff that can help you start to look at, directionally about maybe what activities are going to be helping you out. And it's a clinical grade assessment that we just put out there for free. Like We have a team of 15 PhDs that built this thing and just said, here you go. But I think what's cool to see is typically the best cognitive benefit comes from the game that you enjoy the most. So the way I've seen it over the last 6 years is games and music are a lot like food for your nervous system. And so if you're craving to listen to some, I don't know, Journey at night, that means your nervous system is probably saying, like the same way we crave food. And it's like, well, why was I craving like having a steak that night? And you realize like, oh, my iron might have been a little low or something like that. Well, I think, we crave music in a similar way, and also games, and games being that really powerful interactive tool. That's where it's so different than, if you're out there condemning games while you're doom scrolling on Instagram or TikTok, you are the problem. It's like you are you are the literal problem. And what's cool about games, because scrolling is passive media. So back to the brain preserving energy, brain's shutting, it's like checked out. And now you're passively intaking stimuli, whether you want to or not a healthy thing to do a lot. Like you can do it a little bit, but bad. And games, interactive media. So it's two-way.
It's fascinating because along with the a lot of similarities neurologically to what you were talking about with adventure therapy too, is the engagement. And we have to watch out. I have learned, working a lot with addictions as I do, that when someone comes in and they say, I have an addiction, and normal clinical practice, but I've learned that it is very important to get into the weeds of like, okay, what are we talking? Frequency, intensity, and of course, maladaptivity is way more important than how much you're doing of something. And the thing that I have learned, and why you have to really define that up front, is there are many people who are like, oh, I believe I have an addiction because I'm doing a thing that people in my life don't understand or they don't like. And so, and I see a lot with young people where it's like, oh, they have a real gaming addiction. And it's like, yes, sometimes they do. Is it like, boy, if you can't get to it, it's like, oh, it's huge trauma and this and that. And there's these things that you see, just that you see, as you said, with the process addictions with any behavior are possible. And certainly also with substance. I've learned I have to screen that. It's like, well, how much do you drink and what does it do? And it's like, oh, maybe my spouse doesn't want me to do it at all. And so any alcohol in the house is an addiction according to them. Versus, which not justification for people to deny their addiction, by the way, little qualifier. But, a lot of times with video games, it's just, I don't like them. I don't think they're good. I don't think they should do them. And, I don't get it. And scroll. Or even just, like I'm a fan of movies. And one of the things that was a turning point for me was when I talked to, I'm a casual, I casually engage with video games, but to real gamers and talking about it and realizing like, this is a long interactive movie. That's pretty dope. I like it. I like the idea and being able to let people engage with what they like. It's fascinating to hear that is another kind of maybe predictive element of success, and that correlates the enjoyment level, which only makes sense. I mean, I'm more likely to do it as the other thing. What am I actually going to do?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the power of play and the power of games, because after all, like a video game it's a digital form of play. And just like adventure therapy, we pick different types of adventure, or in play therapy, like one of my professors, we did this, you like kind of grab hands and you like point your finger kind of like they're swords, and you put your feet next to the other person's foot, and your job is to like poke the other person. Okay. And she picked me on purpose. I was a lot bigger than she was, and she was pregnant at the time with her other baby like in her backpack. And okay. I'm like, I don't really want to do this. And she's like, why? I'm like, I don't want to like knock you over. She's like, no, we got to go. And, we're going all in here. And I'm like, it's your baby. And she stopped the class and she was like, what are we learning about Joe right now? And we stopped and it's like, okay, Joe has a sense of care for me in this moment. There's a sense of empathy that's there. But what are we saying about, what other things that we might be seeing? So it's like just that small play interaction from the outside, from a bunch of other therapists watching that, they could learn a lot about me. And that's part of what I love about play and probably when people are intoxicated are two of the scenarios when people are more authentic. Now we don't have alcohol therapy, and we probably should not. But
However, I've interviewed a lot of people who there are like very controlled uses of ketamine and other things that now people are combining psychotherapy with those treatments. And so, to your point, controlled, medically appropriate, altered state in that way too can actually be good. Even though, yeah, you're right. We don't say let's sit and do some shots and then do therapy, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it all like alcohol is one of the oldest drugs, and there's study that was out that was literally, drinking seemed to be correlated with less PTSD or trauma for like war veterans, for example, and stress. We know it's alcohol.
Which would be also why there's a risk factor for addiction as well, because it helps, right? I mean, that's things that don't, addiction's a solution, not a problem, but sort of a thinking. Yeah, there we go.
I talked to a hepatologist in Australia who wanted to talk to Solston, and she was just like, I replace livers every day, and then they go and destroy the liver right afterwards. The liver's not the problem, the drinking's the problem. Right. But the drinking isn't the problem. The trauma from before that is usually the thing
that they're drinking and why, right?
That caused that. And the drinking is just a half-baked bad solution long term, but with drinking, when like Uncle Johnny or whoever is like, oh, he's angry when he drinks whiskey. It's like, no, he's angry. And when he drinks whiskey, he's less inhibited. Or Andrea is so happy when she drinks. She's probably a really happy person and doesn't feel she can express that but it's an inhibition issue. Or with games, when we play, it's like, hey, that person's it's a 35-year-old female, and when they play this game, they're like a young male character, and well, that's who she gets to choose to be when no one's watching. Because games you can play in a way where you don't have to worry about society shaping how you express yourself, and because you go into a flow state, you forget about that regulation. So like histrionic personality disorder or cluster Bs in general. Like when you first meet them, and oh my gosh, are they typically very good at regulating how they come off. But that veil goes away over time because they can't keep up the act forever. And that's why people who end up in relationships with them or, et cetera, it just ends up being a bad story. But they're like, but they were so amazing for the first X amount of time. And it was like, that was when they could keep the mask on. But in a state of play, like literally we were on another podcast and the guy came out and said like, yeah, I like to like crush people. And the podcast host was like, did you just out yourself? Oh, like in like public, like in the, and I think
going with that theory, that's really who you are. And now it lets you be that person. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's part of in adventure therapy. There's something called the GRABS model, GRABBS. And it's part of that is being able to see, based on how the person plays and how they act in those settings, like you can pull a lot of really interesting stuff away in terms of diagnosis, treatment, things like that. And so what we notice, and that's part of why we do traditional assessment combined with assessing how people play the games, you can actually start to really see, what's actually having impact on the anxiety. Is it the person's level of resilience? How are you measuring resilience? Well, when their base gets destroyed, maybe they rebuild it really quickly. So we take all the data and we're able to see these things. And the cool thing about play too in games, like back to adherence, like you don't have to a good game. And this is what game developers do. They think about how can I keep the game so that it's sustainably engaging. There's no game developer that we work with, and we work with most of the major ones that are just like, yeah, we need people addicted. They all know that that's really bad for business. Like you want that person who's playing maybe an hour a day, but it's sustainable over time. That's a good business. So, how do I create sustainable engagement? I use the same example with relationships. I've never heard someone say like, I'm in this like really, really healthy relationship. Yeah, it's not engaging at all though. It's like engagement became a bad word. Games became, there's a stigma there. But now if you still have a stigma about games and you are a psychotherapist or psychologist, I'm sorry, but the research is just, if you're empirically based, which you should be because you shouldn't have a license if you're not, the research is overwhelming. Even with like shooting games, it's very clear now. There's been so many studies that show there's no increase in violence whatsoever. In fact, the opposite. We see kids that had violent propensities actually aggression goes down when they play, shooting games. So overall, though, what's nice about play is you get this authentic version of yourself, and that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges for psychologists, psychotherapists is human beings are poor observers of our own cognition. We're poor observers of each other's cognition. Therefore, assessment is really important. Getting a baseline of, like, I had one patient who had been being treated for ADHD for 8 years. He's on, switched different meds. Oh, these didn't work. Okay, maybe you have this kind of ADHD. There's that camp of all that. And we did a neuropsych eval on him. Came back and said, "Hey, you don't have ADHD, but you do have narcissistic personality disorder." And then, I mean, that's
underdiagnosed,
a lot of,
particularly in people who are not cruel or who have a niceness, or those personality cluster B things can be underdiagnosed in people. I've noticed this a lot with cluster B, borderline personality disorder. People who are suffering with it, it's underdiagnosed because they're not mean. So that, if that makes sense, I've just seen it so many times. And then after diagnosis, people try to convince someone they're not. If you don't seem like that. Oh no. And doctors, therapists, you don't seem like it's. We're still treating that like it's an insult rather than a diagnosis in a medical situation.
Yeah. It's, and so, and that's the thing, you're not going to see all those things typically in a therapeutic setting, especially cluster Bs. Like, they're the best at getting, especially in couples therapy, making the other person seem like, I mean, that's what narcissists do, right? They call other people narcissists and they tell on themselves. They're so good at telling on themselves. It's wild. And same with borderlines, same with histrionics. The amount of projection is, and so you have a lot of like younger therapists sometimes that'll end up believing that the partner is the one who has the cluster B personality disorder because they're so good at smearing and gaslighting, and therapists tend to be pretty empathetic. So it's like, wow,
and particularly if they're not there with the spouse, a lot of times, because relationships come up in individual counseling too, and it's very easy to validate, and fall into a trap there, like you said. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, and that's why I'm such a big advocate for assessment. Like, and I always found, like, this individual was very apprehensive about it. And I was like, okay, I think we're not going to find ADHD. I don't know what we were going to find. Like, sometimes it might be like schizotypal personality disorder. There's a lot of theories of ADHD. I personally think that it's more of an off gas of a number of underlying symptoms. I know Dr. Amen has, like, there's 7 types of ADHD, for example, but that I put that aside, but the symptoms all look the same. And I'm like, well, are we diagnosing the symptoms? And some people with, NPD can have ADHD like symptomology that's happening, but totally 2 different things when we talk about treatment. It's like, that person, that's CBT is not going to work for somebody who has narcissistic personality disorder. Like, for those, like, because I had some cluster Bs, I'm a big fan of dialectical behavioral therapy. And there's some really good research, like, showing that with borderline histrionic, that it's working and we're getting better at it. So back to games and play, what I love about it is this ability to basically understand the person in this authentic way, and then allow the game to change or adapt to a person in a way that's actually benefiting them and helping them over time. So yeah, how do we get that up and running so that every live game in the world can be adapting to a person in a way that's healthier for them? So what we see is, actually, we measure sleep data, anxiety, depression, all these kind of things, amongst a lot of other stuff. And what we see is, when you get the right personality with the right game, those things get better over time, actually. So the game acts as a healer. And right now there's a shortage of therapists, a shortage of psychologists everywhere in the world, and we're running into mental health crisis at the moment. And to me, this is a scalable solution in the meantime to the current state of mental health in the world. And I think the more successful, personally, I think that the mental health challenges we have as a society is the result of the success that we built. Idle hands are the devil's playground. Our great grandparents had to see people starve to death, and in the United States, for the most part, food has been solved for, and that created these other problems. And now, if you have a society without purpose, people without ability to progress or learn or grow, yes, there's going to be a lot of mental health
we
issues.
see burnout at a younger and younger age with some of the requirements mounting and the time constraints that take away the social part of high school and just all those various things. Yeah, exactly. And I'm very, and people can go back and hunt down some of the episodes here where I take a stand sometimes that people think is weird. I'm kind of anti-productivity. If productivity is our primary goal, as you put it, like it's the same thing with the brain being efficient. It's efficient at helping us be healthy when we're feeding it healthy practices, but it's also efficient that if I'm told that I'm a piece of garbage my whole life, my brain is going to efficiently say, that's what we're doing? Okay, great. Well, here's a thought process to reinforce that. So very powerful stuff, very useful stuff. And it goes along with one of the things that I try to highlight on the show here, which is cutting edge techniques and the way people are doing research at the same time we're researching through administration of useful treatment as well. And so it builds on itself. I'm really, really grateful for the time that you've taken today to come and share that with everybody. I want to give you a chance to tell people more about Solstein and where to find that and everything. I always like to ask people, though, if they have a little recommendation that they could give listeners in the area of community give back. Let's say it could be a nonprofit or a charity, or it could just be something that you like to do or would suggest people could do in order to be in touch with and help their community. It absolutely can be related to this, but it also does not have to be.
Yeah. I think, so for Solstin, if you go to wellbeing.solstin.io, I think that's a great way to just kind of see some of, yourself and the data. And it's a chance people do online quizzes. This is the type of assessment that you'd have to pay $1,000 to go to a doctor and do. So it's free. We put it out there. You can kind of see what's there. Play a game. Don't get addicted, but play a game. I think if you look at health data, like we looked at across all the different games that we have in our database, which I think is like 300,000 of them, the ones that were the highest for like improving all the different mental health measures tended to be actually the oldest ones. So chess outperformed pretty much every other game, whether it's digitally or physically played. So if you haven't played a game of chess for a while, go and play some chess. And then like from I'm a firm believer that nature and adventure in nature, like if I had my way, that's the way to do it. Like video games are amazing. They're accessible, but you can't beat really good adventure therapy. You can't beat nature. You can't beat the biophilia effect. So there's a charity that I really like called Big City Mountaineers. What they do is they take kids from the inner city and they bring them to the mountains. And if you donate to like hospitals, or if you donate to these sort of different things, and we talk back to the impact of mental health on disease, on hospital visits, and you want to go upstream, maybe thinking about something related to mental health. And that's, for me, things that help younger or youth go to nature. I'm really big on those types of charities, and I think Big City Mountaineers is a really good one.
Very cool. Very cool. I can tell you lived in Park City, because there's a lot of that up there too, and stuff. It's the very, very powerful. And we've had people talk about this, and in fact, you see the trends of like forest bathing and stuff. We don't have time to get all into that, but some of those things that are very, very useful and powerful, we're actually once again starting to measure some of those things that we weren't sure worked, and some of those things we're pretty sure worked, but yet we're finding out how to maximize them. So Very, very appreciative of that. And I'm very impressed with and glad about the work that you are doing out there, especially the accessibility. Accessibility is so huge. And that's something I'm endeavoring to do, not only through this podcast, but in my practice as well, trying to say, what things can I put out there in order for people to be able to take advantage of something for free or less expensive to do something that they might be able to do. So that's one of the things that I'll put out there too. If anybody, there's all these various ways you can get involved with the podcast, but increasingly the umbrella I'm moving everything under is just my website, dwighthurst.com, and you can find free to cheap resources there and some self-study courses and things. It's branching out every day and every week. I'm adding some more stuff to that, and I've seen the traffic. I know some of you, somebody logged on from Pakistan the other day. I bet that's not someone who's down the road looking for a therapist. That's probably someone who's listened to the show, and I appreciate all of that participation, and would love to hear from people on this too. What are you doing to have adventures and outdoor stuff in your life? I would encourage people to send a message. Once again, the website, dwighthurst.com/podcast. There's a place for a survey and for feedback as well. And love to hear from all of you. Joe, one more time, thank you so much for being here and for the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Dwight. Really appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening to the Court and Parts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court and Parts shows, visit courtandarts.com.
Givaderm, located at givaderm.com, is a high-quality organic skincare product. Their belief is that if there's anything in your skin products that you wouldn't be comfortable ingesting, then you shouldn't be putting it on your body, because you are ingesting it in a way by putting it on your body. Don't ingest the products, by the way, just a quick disclaimer. But they are safe organic products, and that's a really cool group of people. For Broken Brain listeners, you can get a 10% discount on some of these things if you have gifts that you need to give, or just giving a gift to yourself. So go to givaderm.com/brokenbrain, or go to dwighthurst.com/support and click on the direct link to get your 10% discount today.